Mike Sharman's Victorian railway was very well known on the exhibition trail until he built it into his loft some years back. All the models on the layout are to EM gauge clearances, including the broad gauge, although the latter is to the correct 28mm gauge. Here we see a standard gauge Crampton, London, crossing the broad gauge main line. Mike takes up the story.
This London North Western gantry is at the entrance to Bogsworth Junction, and the two trains entering are Flirt of the Chatham and Dover Railway, which is backing onto its train, and the London and North Western Railway, Liverpool, which was built by Berry, Curtis and Kennedy, again in 1840s. Flirt here is a jackshaft Crampton, which means that it's got just two wheels driven by a crank. Coming off the other end of the train is London, Chatham and Dover Railway Spey, which is an 042 tank. She's moved down onto the sector plate, which was quite a commonly used piece of railway machinery in the early days, because it saved, in this instance, it saved something like the length of 3 sets of points. They were sometimes hand-worked and sometimes had a donkey engine working them, and were in varied places. For instance, there was one at Ventnor in the Isle of Wight, and there was one in one of the big Birmingham stations. Liverpool's just arrived on an incoming train, has been uncoupled, and we move up to the head shunt. Liverpool is a London North Western engine, and in fact most of Bogsworth is based on London North Western practice. The building coming into view now is a London North Western sectional building with the screens on the outside, and these screens and panels were often made up in a factory and brought on site and assembled to whatever size you wanted the station to be. This loco is a 222 Furness well tank, just left the coaling stage. It's motored with a Case Mark II motor through a gearbox and onto the centre driving wheel, which is as it should be. It's balanced between the two pony wheels by a very lightly adjusted coil spring, so that if there's over-energetic handling on the controls, the engine does pitch when it's either started or stopped. Here we have the railway policeman sat on top of the coaches, and his job was to put the brakes on should the train break up, as it often did, and disappear in sections. The London North Western slotted post signals just gone off, and in the early period they were all of this variety, with the holes cut in them supposedly to cut down wind resistance. The larger gantry that we're passing under is the same pattern, and you can see it's designed exactly for Bogsworth's platform layout. The model of Liverpool, who's backing down from the head shunt now, is something like 20 years old and is an early example of the free bogie system in the tender, whereby the front four wheels are cosmetic and the tender is resting on the footplate of the locomotive. This gives you a lot more traction because the Crampton relies purely on that single wheel to haul the train along. The large sheaves on the driving wheels are 2'9" diameter and had to be lubricated over the side with an oil can quite frequently to prevent trouble. Flirt leaves now with its train, passing the southeastern Crampton, the old number 92, built by Stephenson's. Flirt has again a Case Mark II motor and is geared through 40-to-1 gearing with the free bogie tender. And with the length of the locomotive and the weight in the boiler and the weight in the tender is a very powerful engine indeed. The train it's pulling, you'll notice they're very short vehicles and they look rather like 3 stagecoaches joined together, which in fact was what the design was based on. Flirt's arriving in the mixed gauge workshops station, which was the first part of the layout to be built as a backdrop into all the collection of Victorian locomotives, along with a lot of the Victoriana that went with it. Large cast iron water columns, which in some cases weigh well over a tonne. This shot shows the 8-foot 6-wheeled Cornwall in its original form as built in 1847, with the boiler down between the frames. The rebuilt version of the original now exists in the York Rower Museum. Flirt's leaving its train up into the head shunt, passing the steam navvy, which is digging out the broad gauge extension into the next section of the layout. These steam navvies were worked by a big vertical boiler donkey engine, and this one, as you can see, is just passing Isambard, studying the plans. This is number 10, one of the earliest models in the collection of an early Hackworth engine, an 060, with 2 tenders. The wheels are cast in 2 pieces, and to keep them together they've got wooden plugs hammered into recesses, and then the whole thing was trued up on the track afterwards. The following train is of children wagons and small short wheelbase coal wagons, which were hauled by horses round the quarries into position and then coupled up to the main train. This side of the main line we have the main power source for the workshops, which is a large flywheel beam engine with a low pressure single cylinder. The coal being delivered by the narrow gauge feeder line with a little works locomotive, which is passing the machines on the inside, this one being a milling machine, all driven by belts from overhead. The lathe on the far side, driven from extensions from the other pulleys. Here we have the erecting shop with several of the bits of locomotives laying about, and this shed is connected to the number 1 shed by the traverser. And in the number 1 shed we've got the forge with a bellows operated by a chain. We've got a paint shop in the background with people rubbing down and painting, and we've got the works fire engine on duty standing by outside. Moving out onto the traverser is the Kitson 7-foot Midland Railway Crampton with, again, a Case motor. The traverser itself is operated by another motor under the deck through quite low gearing, and all the solenoids and contacts are easily accessible because the deck can be picked out and serviced upside down, as are the turntables on the rest of the layout. This is one of 2 of this pattern of Crampton, number 130 and 131, and none of them lasted more than a few years because the track and loading conditions in Britain resulted in very big and heavy trains, and with a single driving wheel the Cramptons just weren't equipped to cope. One of the most successful passenger classes on the Great Western Broad Gauge was the Firefly class. There were some 60 of these built by 9 different builders, and it's coming into a model of one of the stations of the period which had an up and a down station rather than a station either side of the tracks. This meant that the up and the down line crossed in a centre complex, and the trains were serviced from the middle, often by horse shunting. While the trains were being made up in the platforms, there is a passing line which can be used both up and down, and we see here Titios, which is an 060 goods, going at the moment past the down station. It's an outside framed locomotive, and with the usual mixed variety of broad gauge stock. Broad gauge signals were based around 2 main types, a disc and bar and a fantail or a board-shaped signal. The permutations were that when the bar was showing with the arrow of the fantail pointing to the track, it was dead stop. The arrow pointing away from the track with the disc was clear ahead, and the arrow pointing to the track again with the disc was a caution. The double junction shown here is in fact just a double disc and bar. The bars had several attachments to them, this one being a level crossing signal showing the bar top and bottom. Vulcan is one of the very early batch of large-wheeled locomotives, none of which were awfully successful. This one was rebuilt into a tank engine, and a nice photograph of it exists on a turntable dated 1858. The model has a tender drive, which I don't normally like, but it did allow me to put the full crankshaft in between the wheels and allow the valve gear and piston rods to be seen in motion. On this type of station layout, the goods yard in fact formed another through route, and complete trains came into the yard and went across the turntable. This was a particular Great Western feature, and there are photographs about of some of the Welsh lines in standard gauge days with the turntable clearly shown in the entrance to the yard. The turntable serves both the goods yard and the mixed gauge loco shed. Firefly is seen on shed by the Great Western water crane, the pattern of which didn't change right up to the end of steam. Vulcan moves off across the turntable to pause by the timber coaling stage with the early pattern cranes made from rail and ballast on the deck. In the foreground we have the Firefly Electra leaving the up station with three of the very typical squat, broad coaches of the period. They're first-class coaches, and the lamps on the top had to be shared between two compartments. Electra passes on to a standard Brunel timber viaduct, of which there were very many stretching down into the West Country. Back at the up station, we see the entrance to the main station building, where the first-class passengers were accommodated inside and the second and third kept out in the rain. This shows the turntable in the centre complex, which allows the horses to shunt vehicles onto the rear of both the up and the down trains. Coming down the bank towards the dock station is the London Chatham Dover Spey, which is an 042 tank built by Nielsen's in Scotland. She has a pivoted pair of drivers which allow it to clear over the bumps, and the rear pony truck is sprung centralised to guide the entire locomotive into the trackwork. The harbour station is the other end of the workshop's layout, forming two sides of an L. The signal cabin here is one of the type built on stilts used on the South Western with rotary signals. The inlet from the sea shows a small trading sailing ship with all the equipment on the quayside that goes with loading, unloading, coal, cattle, and the 101 things were carried in that period. Albion is a rather unique locomotive, of which only one was built, and yet it lasted some 15 years before it was sold into private ownership. It's got transverse cylinders, and these operate cranks, which in turn operate the wheels. It was used on the South Yorkshire Railway, and for some reason was never copied, and yet must have been reasonably successful. Such an interesting prototype called out to be built, and this one, due to the complications of the mechanism, means that both axles in fact are driven by two bevel gears, which makes it rather noisy. The bevels are then driven from either end of a case motor again with worm wheels which were turned up on the lathe. She's backing down onto a very early rake of card-built coaches. These were cut laboriously from postcard, and close examination shows the slight bowing around the windows that ageing has brought about. The sailing ship was built from an airfix kit of the Discovery, which was the wrong scale. So by leaving the deck housings off and putting 4mm scale wheel and lifeboat fittings, it brought the boat within a usable scale. Part of the narrow gauge network takes us down the line and across the river to the base of the incline, which was used for hauling wagons up and down to the slate quarries, which were laid out on various levels on the side of the hill. They were operated by a big drum in the roof of the building, and this drum simply unwound one cable as the wagon went down, winding the other one up. Quite often the weight of the full wagon would be used against a brake to pull the empty wagon up on the opposite track.
Most parts of the layout and the stock were built over 20 years ago. Mike's interests remain with pre-1870 prototypes, but he is now building to Proto 4 standards for 4mm models. The latest model is this Great Northern Sturrock Goods, in its original form with a powered tender. The class was very successful, but only lasted in this form for a few years, as the footplate crews demanded extra wages for running 2 engines. Sturrock refused any increase, and the crews refused to work them, so the tender power units were removed. In any event, the locomotives were too powerful for their day, and it's difficult to believe that the boilers were up to supplying steam to both power units for long periods. The model uses Mike's own wheels and is completely scratch-built, except for the 2 motors, which are the trusty old K's Mark IIs. In our first issue, Mike Jolly showed us how to build the basic structure of a model building, the prototype of which is situated on the Salisbury to Warminster line at Boyton. With the basic structure complete and corners cleaned up, Mike now describes how to add the details that bring life to the model.
As you may have seen in the first part, the corners are butt jointed. Mitering the corners is extremely difficult, and I do not recommend it. When the corner has been filed square, the bonding is extended through the exposed edge of the embossed brick plasticard. I do this with a fine file. A file ground to the width of the bonding is a good idea if you do not have a suitable file available. Filing soft plastic produces burrs. These are removed by a combination of scraping with a razor blade and brushing with a brass wire brush that will remove burrs from scribed or filed grooves. To make the arches over doors or windows, or for that matter tunnel portals, bridges, culverts, etc., I use pre-scribed sheets of 20 thou plasticard that matches the 20 thou embossed brick. I have the advantage of the parallel motion of a drawing board for scribing sheets of plasticard, but recently Evergreen's imported plastic sheet that is machined with remarkably precise V-grooves is available that may be suitable. The pre-scribed sheet is cut to 3mm strips, the length of a brick, the type of arch in this building. I curved the arch by cutting approximately halfway along the bond between the bricks. Formerly, the bonding has been taken into the window reveals in the same way as the corners of the building. The embossed brick is removed over the windows or other openings to the shape of the arch required. I'd recommend a template to cut the arch, especially if a large number of similar arches are required. It is helpful if the brick plasticard is not welded to the building's structure. Before fitting out interior detail, glazing is added. I use the material that is soluble with normal solvents, as I prefer to add glazing bars and sash frames from plasticard. If the window sashes or frames are to be painted on, it is not essential, although the soluble material is clearer. The ground floor interior consists in this case of partition walls and a lining to the ground floor walls that supports the first floor. If a great deal of detail is to be added, I'd make it up as a separate unit of floor and wall linings that can be dropped into position. When fitting plastic, such as the first floor here, I use a plane as it is precise, and filing and sanding produces dust that sticks to everything. For the upper floor, because the narrow stairwell of tongue and groove boarding was close to the window and could be seen on the prototype, I decided to include it. Prescribed sheet was again used and painted a neutral colour. In fact, it could not be seen on the completed building. The two doors for this building were produced as a pair. I find it saves time and is much easier to mass produce where possible. The stiles or side timbers of this panelled door are laid up on a piece of 40 thou plasticard, the critical dimension being that between the two stiles. The overall dimension is larger than the opening. The top, bottom and middle locking rail are let in. The mullions, the vertical timbers within the overall framing, are similarly let in. This in many instances would have been the finished door after a light sanding to ensure the raised surfaces are flush. These doors have flush panelling with a decorative moulding around their edges. A bevel on the edge of the material for the panels simulates this moulding. I scraped a bevel onto the edge of the panelling and cut the bevel on the ends of the panel with a razor blade. When the let-in panels have hardened, the whole is sanded again. The door is fitted from the inside and the door frame added around the edge. I prefer the look of raised glazing bars and framing. The only exception I'd make are for leaded windows, where I use a mapping pen and paint for the lead work. The windows are made in the same way as the doors, but naturally with much smaller pieces of plasticard. The ceiling and base for the roof is made from 2 sheets of 40 thou plasticard. I fit the lower of the 2 sheets between the walls to prevent distortion of the walls. Normally the upper sheet would extend over the walls to form the soffit, the underside of the bit the gutters are fitted to in most buildings, but it does not in this case. Generally, it is possible to make up the roof separately, but the smaller roof was built up in situ. The first row of roofing material is particularly important. Otherwise good buildings are often marred by too large a gap between the tiles or slates and the guttering, so I pay particular attention to this feature, having got it wrong in the past. In this case, a fillet was necessary to complete the basis of the roof structure. Remember also that if you choose to use the method shown here, or you overlap the tiles, that the first row must be raised at its leading edge to the same angle as the other rows of tiles. The edges of the roof were trimmed parallel to the building. I prefer to use a plane for many operations, but you do need to know how to sharpen and set a plane to a setting not used in carpentry. I fitted a soffit to the wall and a fascia to the part that carries the guttering. These were trimmed to the gable end brickwork, this building having no barge boards. This idea uses a combination of strips prescribed vertically to represent the joints between the slates or tiles, the object being to raise the leading edge of the strips by 5 thou to give the impression of one row overlapping the previous row. In this way, the slates are butted one to another, not overlapped. Each row was raised by a piece of cotton, but I think in future I'd use 5 thou plastic strip. These may be from 10 thou and tiles from 15 or 20 thou if preferred, the visually critical point being where the edges are seen and require to be thin. The first row is raised by a strip of plasticard on its leading edge that should extend ½ mm over the edge of the roof to the centre position to be taken by the guttering. The strips of slate must be applied to the roof in the same relative position that they were cut from the sheet, so the strips should be marked and numbered. Slipped slates may be simulated by adding an overlay to the front of the slates. This is an extremely quick and simple method of producing well-maintained slate or tiled roofs, taking an hour or two rather than the tens of hours required if individual slates or tiles are applied. It is obviously not suitable to model poorly maintained or derelict buildings. For the most part, railway companies valued and maintained their buildings. Avoiding 5 thou plastic for slates allows for generous amounts of solvent to be used without the risk of distortion or the lifting of strips that looks horrendous. The ridge tiles consisted of an angle, butted and welded and cleaned up. Once in place, it was marked for the raised joints made from suitable 10 thou strip. I trim small items with a safety razor blade that can be cut to useful shapes with a pair of scissors. I trimmed the overhanging slates using a steel rule as a guide. Note that on good quality roofs there are no half-width slates but extra wide 1½ times size at the edges. These are less vulnerable to wind damage. Half-round guttering is simple to produce. I use the ground end of a drill to route out the inside of the gutter. The drill is pushed along the plastic, holding it against a steel rule. The front edge, if necessary, is cut back to the concave scribing. The sheet is then turned over and the outer curve produced by scraping. The guttering is then cut off, there being no curve against the soffit. The joints are simulated with 5/1000 strip that can be curved as it softens under the influence of the solvent. Rainwater heads were carved from solid plastic, but suitable white metal castings may be available. A strand of copper wire is wound around a drill or a piece of wire so that it is a tight spring fit on the plastic rod to be used. When cut in rings, it simulates the raised rings on the rainwater pipes, shoes, swan necks, etc. The rings are slipped onto over-length plastic rod that has a lead-in or taper filed onto its end. I make earpieces, the fixings for the cast rainwater systems, from 2/3 of a brick from the brick sheet. Joints in guttering and rainwater pipes are at approximately 6-foot centres, although I've seen a drawing where they are 5 foot 10 inches. So if possible, check your particular building or a building of an appropriate age.
Probably the most famous of all model railways is that at Pendon Museum at Long Wittenham in Oxfordshire. Pendon is the product of one man's vision. Roy England arrived in Plymouth in May 1925 from Australia in order to patent an electrically controlled model railway system. Roy stayed with a cousin on the edge of the Vale of White Horse and resolved to reproduce the English countryside and its railways in miniature as they were in the 1930s. As we view Pendon's most recent locomotive, a Churchwood 4500 class prairie tank, we can see the first stage of the creation of the Pendon Museum, the Dartmoor scene. Centerpiece of the Dartmoor scene is the junction station at Pentor Road. This is a fictional junction on the south side of Dartmoor, situated near Ivy Bridge. The Prairie is heading a mixed local goods off the South Devon main line onto the branch, which goes across Dartmoor to Yelverton and Porthcarrick on the Cornish coast. The train consists of a typical assortment of vehicles of the 1930s, and these include private owner coal wagons, cattle wagons, covered vans, and bogie bolster wagons, such as the one seen carrying signal posts. The train illustrates one of the museum concepts, which is to show complete trains of the period modelled. Each train had a specific function, the mixed goods carrying all kinds of materials to local stations, fulfilling the railway's role as a common carrier. Coming off the branch and past the engine shed is a local passenger train. The goods train is held at the down branch starter to await clearance onto the single line. The local passenger consists of 3 early clear-story coaches hauled by a Duke Class 440. This was a typical West Country train of the interwar period. Once the passenger train has cleared the single line, the starter clears to give the road to the goods, which sets off to the west. As the goods pulls out, we can see the engine of the local passenger train. She is the Lizard, which was built to a design by William Dean in 1895 as a member of the Duke class. The model was built by Andrew Fields and, like all Pendon locomotives, is powered by a Portiscat motor. The model is based on a photograph taken by Roy England in 1927 and is therefore an exact scale model of the locomotive at that date. She was withdrawn in 1938 and was equipped with a short wheelbase 2,000-gallon tender to suit the short West Country branch line turntables. As the train pulls away, it passes under the typical covered GW footbridge with storerooms under the stairways. On the platforms, the ever-patient passengers are engaged in endless conversation, perhaps not realizing that theirs is possibly the heyday of railways before the impact of the motor vehicle was to change a way of life, more so than politics at home and abroad. We now see the mixed goods passing over another well-known Pendon feature. The branch crosses a deep valley north of Pentor Road by a timber fan viaduct. These were often used by the GWR and associated companies throughout the system, but are particularly associated with the West Country lines. Timber was a basic material for railway bridges and was gradually replaced by embankments, steel structures, and masonry arches. The model is set against a deep backdrop of typical Dartmoor scenery, granite hills and sparse vegetation. It has a great feeling of depth and space and puts the trains into perspective, an achievement few model railways can aspire to. The branch is single line over the viaduct and at the north end passes into a tunnel. In the distance, we see a Churchwood mogul heading west with an excursion train on the main line embankment. The coaches are mainly collet designs, which were current during the period depicted. The main line would be capable of handling all types of GWR locomotives up to double rev restriction, but the branch would be limited to light categories only. She is taking the down main, or westbound through road, on a section of the layout which is not yet in regular use for public showings. The station buildings are based on those at Ivy Bridge and Yelverton, both of which were typical of the area modelled, and the general layout of the station echoes that of Yelverton, which was the junction for the Princeton branch. The western extreme of the main line runs into Beech Hill Tunnel, from which emerges Guy Williams's justly famous model of a Great Western heavy freight locomotive of the 2800 series. Number 2844 has been a regular favourite for many years and is immensely powerful. The train she is hauling represents the South Wales coal trains, which were a major feature of the steam railway. Such a coal train is not strictly correct for the South Devon main line, but it's rather a foretaste of what is being prepared for the Vale of White Horse line, which represents the Great Western main line from London to Bristol and South Wales. Pendon itself is situated in the Vale of Whitehorse, and the museum was started in 1954 when Roy England purchased a recently closed pub, the Three Poplars, at Long Wittenham. The pub was reopened as a youth hostel, and Roy showed his collection of models to the guests. The museum attracted a number of new helpers, amongst whom was Tony Smith, who offered help with carpentry. Tony ended up doing a little more, and personally built every one of the wagons in this train, long before the advent of pre-printed wagon kits. Experiments were made with 2844 to see what her haulage capacity was. She easily pulled the prototype maximum of 105 wagons, and not all the models have pinpoint bearings, and went on to master a total of 136 wagons. .4304 was part of the first batch of Churchward's highly successful mixed-traffic moguls. The class was not part of his original standardization scheme, but was produced from standard components from the scheme after his assistant, Holcroft, had seen moguls operating successfully in the United States. This model, by Tony Reynolds, is finished to the usual Pendon high standard in the unlined green livery used by the Great Western on all except its top-line engines. Pendon's track is laid to EM gauge fine-scale standards with hand-built trackwork. Rail is bullhead type with cosmetic chairs added after laying. The same standards are used on both the Dartmoor and the Vale of Whitehorse scenes. At the north end of the viaduct, a steam rail motor is emerging from the tunnel on a branch service. The sheer scale of the viaduct is seen to advantage in this view, with the brooding Dartmoor hills and atmosphere captured to perfection. Whilst the rail motor approaches the junction, we see an up cattle train behind a Dean Goods on the main line. Note the variety of cattle vans and their ownership. Livestock traffic was once widespread on Britain's railways, but it is all gone now. Sheep, horses and cattle merited special stock and handling facilities at nearly all stations. The rail motor is running wrong road in order to use the bay platform at Pentor Road. Rail motors were common in the Plymouth area after the turn of the century and were used for local services. This one has formed a connecting service with the main line from Yelverton, and it can take water from the standard Great Western water frame as it awaits its return journey. Passengers have to hurry as the local connecting service is running in on the down main line. The locomotive is a curved-framed bulldog, another type of locomotive which had strong associations with the West Country, their final duties being to assist trains over the fearsome Devon banks. The locomotive modelled is Sedgemoor, which boasted a combined name and number plate. One of the originals is owned by Pendon and is on display at the museum. The train that she's hauling is fully equipped with carriage lighting. One of the highlights of the display is when the house lights are dipped and the fully detailed interiors of these coaches are seen to full advantage. You'll have to go to Pendon to see this. It really cannot effectively be portrayed on video. The atmosphere of Dartmoor itself is captured in cameo scenes such as this small farm eking out a precarious existence on the valley floor. Dartmoor sheep have the run of the open moorland, and a rocky stream cascades down over the granite rocks. The wild moorland makes a perfect setting for the viaduct. It was based upon Walcombe Viaduct near Tavistock. The deck, some 35 feet above the stone columns, was supported by 4 raking arms, giving a span of 66 feet. Although relatively cheap in initial outlay, maintenance costs were high. As revenue increased, they could be replaced by other structures. Walcombe was rebuilt in 1910 after 51 years' service. The train now in view is a China clay train, headed by a 4400 class prairie tank. This model was built by Paul Morgan, and the prototype was the first class of small prairie, numbering only 10 locomotives, which had smaller wheels than the subsequent 4500 and 4575 classes. China clay remains a major West Country industry today. The short wheelbase open wagon with tarpaulin remaining in use into 1987. Pendon's branch from the Cornish coastline serves the clay deposits on the south side of Bodmin Moor. The details incorporated in Pentor Road have provided a springboard for the main Vale of White Horse scene, including models of individuals, such as Bob Symes, studying the timetable forever. With the road set, the rail motor sets off along the branch again. The model is another of Guy Williams's products and includes full details such as engine crew and passengers. The bogie suspension is a copy of the prototype as designed by William Dean. There is no central pivot. It is suspended either side from the frames. The rail motor slows as it passes the signal box to enable the driver to collect the single line token, and passes Pentor engine shed as it departs towards Yelverton. The shed serves mainline engines which are banned from the branch. Prominent amongst them is St Dunstan, the first model specifically ordered by Roy England for the future Pendon and built by Guy Williams. The turntable was built by Tony Reynolds and is capable of turning locomotives up to the size of moguls. On the turntable is Tony's model of 5233, a type which was rare but not unknown in the West Country. Locomotive depot details include a wooden coaling stage. Beside the sand dryer stands Pendon's first locomotive, number 5624, which Roy England bought when he ordered St Dunstan. All the buildings are based on West Country designs. The shed on Launceston, whilst the building in the Y of the junction is Yelverton, built by Iliff and Doris Stokes and finished by Guy Williams. The 4500 class is running round a branch train, using the head shunt alongside the main line. This model was built by Andrew Fields and is again a West Country prototype. Pendon's locomotives have been built by a group of builders from the Bristol area. Guy Williams is the museum's chief mechanical engineer and has overall responsibility for the provision of motive power. In addition to those we have seen, there are mainline locomotives for the Vale scene, which have appeared at regular intervals on the Dartmoor line. As the prairie runs round its train, we look across at the station from the moor and see a Southern Railway local train on the Down main line, headed by an M7 tank. Exchange workings between Southern and Great Western trains on their respective Dartmoor main lines were a daily occurrence, to enable men from each company to remain familiar with each other's routes in case of emergency diversions. The up train is headed by River Plym. This is another Guy Williams model, this time of a straight-framed bulldog. The museum thus has models of each type of bulldog and Duke class, giving that West Country flavour. Since the Vale of White Horse scene covers the Bristol, Midlands and South Wales main lines, the two layouts give two different views of the Great Western in two completely contrasting landscapes, as well as branch and mainline operation. The Bulldogs train illustrates a further form of traffic. The train includes Great Western siphons, as well as two Southern vans, a four-wheel utility van in green and an XLSWR brake van in the salmon and umber livery of that company. Note the underframe details of all these vehicles. The Dartmoor scene was created as a temporary expedient on the way towards the Vale of White Horse scene, which encompasses all Roy's ambitions. The latter is a long-term project and will be featured separately in Railscale at a later date. Finally, we see the local train setting off past the signal box on the branch. The line-side token apparatus indicates the branch is single line, and the signalman is at the foot of the steps to hand the token to the driver. The branch train consists of the classic Great Western local passenger train, a two-coach B set hauled by a small prairie. These sets consisted of two identical coaches coupled together and could be seen throughout the system.
In the first issue of Railscale, the baseboard construction from 2x1 softwood and chipboard was described. As it's lowered into position, the track can be seen on its elevated bed. In this issue of Railscale, it will be shown how the elevation was achieved, the track was laid, and the basic outline of the scenery prepared. We found the Super N flexible track could be curved easily, but the nature of its manufacture results in it being stiff enough to hold its shape once preformed, with the exception of the ends, which have a powerful tendency to straighten. These characteristics were used to advantage. All the curves were set out by eye, using the track lengths themselves as templates. These were used to transfer the desired curves to the plywood used for the track bases. We cut the 5mm ply to form the track bed with a jigsaw, taking the necessary precautions for safety. The width of the plywood base depends on various factors. On embankments and viaducts, the base must be accurately produced, whereas in the cuttings the width is not too critical. If the picot points are laid as supplied, an over-width formation will be necessary to the dimensions recommended by picot. The track bed was elevated on 5mm ply supports, the parts being glued and pinned with picot track pins. Strength is only achieved once the glue has set. The pins merely locate the part while the glue sets. We tried softwood with the grain both horizontal and vertical, and heights carefully calculated in order to produce even gradients on curves. It didn't work, and we had to break joints or cut through supports to take out irregularities. We'd recommend retrospectively using the 5mm ply throughout, with the exception of large level areas such as the station and yard. The better the track bed, the better the track laying will be, So we took care to sand the track base to a smooth surface, but did not, unfortunately, avoid a sudden change of gradient on one part of the track bed. This large level area is to become an industrial scene with associated industrial buildings and will probably feature private sidings and a stone quarry. It's set at the end of the right-hand baseboard.
I'm going to have to apply it to the cork as well.
Cork with PVA applied to one surface and the track base was laid on the track base. The pair of long radius points forming a facing crossover are placed on the cork base. We use Pico Super N for the plain track, but this type was not available for the point and crossing work, not yet having been released. Switches are to be operated by simple point motors, and these are large relative to 2mm scenery, making location difficult, particularly under single-line embankments. Locate the position of the operating hole by putting the switches into mid-position. We found a pilot hole to be essential, as the cork causes the larger drills to wander erratically. Check the hole is in the correct position. Note that an elongated hole will be less obtrusive than a large round hole, as suggested in the instructions. The pilot hole was drilled using a rechargeable electric mini drill that with a circular saw blade easily cuts the rail in situ, a useful addition to the toolbox. The point motor is not readily fitted to the underside of the baseboard, being primarily designed to be above board with a 4mm scale system of track work. The baseboard was cut away to get access to fit, wire and maintain the motor. On embankments, there's only just room to screw the motor into position using screws and washers. The hole in the baseboard needs to be as large as possible, but remember that the strength of the board could be jeopardized by too large a hole. Ease of access for wiring and maintenance will be appreciated later, although with hinged baseboards, not all work need be carried on upside down. At least that's the theory. The switches and plain track were laid on a generous bed of PVA and pinned, the intention being to remove the pins once the track work is ballasted. A strong concretion of ballast and PVA is the means of holding the track in position once the track pins are removed. Until the ballast is laid, the track work can be lifted should it be necessary, as the PVA does not adhere to the plastic positively. The central lugs of the point motors are removed and the outer lugs bent to provide a fixing with screws and washers. A test of the point motor operation for clearances shows the operating arm protruding above the point tie bar. This is trimmed to height before final fixing. Finally, the screw and washer is shown being screwed in. On the left is the new Pico Super N track that has a double foot. The lower of the two holds the rail in the track base. On the right, the old pattern with the high rail can be seen. The Super N was used for plain track, but the points are to the old standard as shown on the right. The Super N plain track is not entirely compatible with the older type. The rail height is lower, and therefore the relative position of the sleepers varies. Laid directly against the switches, it's lower, but with rail joiners, it becomes higher. A ramp of plastic card was used to bring the plain track up to the switches. It would probably be better to lay the plain track on a separate cork base to that of the switches, but we found this out too late. we found that the rails of switches and plain track could be moved to even up gaps at joints by gripping the rail with end cutters that were tapped with a light hammer. We also found that it's possible to deform the rail joiners by tapping the railhead with a hammer to even up the rail surfaces. This may affect the electrical conductivity of the rail joint if you're relying on them for electrical contacts. A crossover is seen here, plus other track work laid in the manner previously described. The large access holes can be seen in the baseboard. The area to the left is the beginning of the station yard, with a private branch to the quarry and abandoned branch leading off in the centre. Behind, the high-level main line sweeps over the site of the proposed viaduct. Now we turn our attention to the scenery. Basically, all the boards and the lift-out sections are shallow boxes or trays, the edges profiled to suit the projected landscape. The complexity of the lift-out sections results from the clearances necessary for the hidden sidings, weight reduction, and an attempt to vary their shape to disguise the joints in the scenery. Although it might appear difficult to produce such shapes, with a jigsaw, the ply becomes only a little more difficult than card to work with, and the profiles were adjusted as the work proceeded, the overall concept of the landscape having been planned in advance. As before, all construction was with track pins and woodworking glue. Hold the hammer long, as this will ease the driving home of the pins. This box or deep tray is to go into the top left-hand corner and is particularly deep and covers the hidden running lines. The lug raises the base to give clearance to these lines. These lift-out sections are designed to fit the preceding one, this being the last. As the completed base section is put into position, it can be seen that this is a difficult part of the railway to get at. With the right-hand baseboard raised and the camera at eye level, the potential of N Guage for a dramatic landscape without too severe gradients can be seen. It's this aspect of 2mm modelling that we intend to exploit. Both the heights and width possible in a large 2mm model are beyond the range of most 4mm models. Looking at the right-hand board edge, it can be seen we made an attempt at the baseboard joints to ensure a minimum gap in the scenery by setting the adjoining profiles back half the thickness of the ply and edging one of the boards with a strip of ply. This also meant cutting back the chipboard surface and framing to reduce the likelihood of baseboards catching the exposed ends of the rails. From above, we can see the general layout. The main lines enter from the left, with the facing crossover giving access to the yard. Next, we have the branch to the quarry, and finally, the elevated main line. The scenery boxes cover the hidden sidings, probably too well. Time will show whether we've been too ambitious by covering them so completely. The hidden sidings are a very basic pattern of ladder sidings, arranged with 3 for one line and 5 for the other. The 5-siding section has to feed both ends of the layout. And finally, the first train. This enables us to see the extent of the main elevated line, together with all the basic scenery trays in position. The hollow baseboards lend a superb rumble to the Graham Farish Class 37. Note the various risers for the track bed, created as described earlier.
This is a basic kit with painted sides and supplied with transfers to enable a number of vehicles to be produced for this owner. All parts have to be cut from sprues. After trimming of the moulding sprues, clean up for the discrepancies produced by misalignment of the moulds. The kits have no interior detail on floor, sides or ends. I transferred the planking from the outside to the inner and scribed them using a ground drill held in a pin vise. After scribing, the burrs were removed. There are also some other mould marks to be sanded out of the insides and floor. The doors were also simulated in the same way. For details of internal strapping, I'd recommend the articles by Chris Crofts, serialised in Model Railway Journal. This kit required the addition of a ring to the ends of the buffer stocks. Small parts are easily picked up with a scalpel. The coupling hooks required filing to reshape the hook and allow the spring to be an easy fit. With the links fitted and the spring in position, the tabs to hold the spring were bent over. Check for clearance between the underframe timbers. Check the buffers for easy movement and add the spring. Check again and then add the nuts and test again. The side frames were fitted and these were followed by the ends. It is important that the ends are square. In this case I cut back the underframe timbers with a wood chisel to ensure this. It is very important that the underframe floor is fractionally smaller than the theoretical size, as this will ensure the mitered corners come together, otherwise the corner plates will not appear as complete sheets. The sides were then fitted. I do not like to rely on the accuracy of the kit to locate the axle box spring assembly. These were pre-painted on the inside and their position determined by the crown plates on the sole bars. The wheel set was inserted and the opposite axle box spring assembly added, checking that the hole is square. I pre-painted the brake gear and cleaned off those parts where solvent was to be applied. An operating rod and brake lever and ratchet or pinning down bracket was added. In this scale particularly, an etched handle and ratchet would be preferable. The drop doors lack a plate where they either strike the brake gear or door stops. The latter are surprisingly not included in the kit, and were not added here. The end door hinge was cut out and fitted. This is also of a rather basic pattern and could do with modification. Finally, the horse hook was added. This only left painting of the sole bars and underframe. The transfers are easily applied, but the sizes did not correspond with the prototype photograph and were intensely white compared with the pre-painted sides, more so than visible on video. I scribed around the door opening to remove the white paint and produce the effect of wear at the bottom of the door. I cleaned up the corners and slightly rounded the corner plates. The weathering depends on the condition the wagon is to be modelled in. I indicated rust on the door catches, hinges and ironwork and dirtied up the sides. The interior, unpainted wood colour, was dirtied up with Carr's powders that give the impression of residual coal dust. This is probably the simplest of kits and goes together well, but it just lacks a few prototype details that could be added with the necessary research. The photo in the kit is too black to identify a type of axle box, buffers, brake gear, etc.
Oxford Rewley Road layout is the work of the Oxford and District Model Railway Club and is now some 10 years old. It's been widely seen at exhibitions and in the pages of the Model Railway Press. On the first of 12 offices built by the railway to accommodate the coal merchants, we see the street name Rewley Road, the unofficial title of the LMS's Oxford station. Behind the offices can be seen the station master's house and the extensive train sheds, with a parcels train in the bay platform and with a coal yard to the right. At the end of the layout, beyond the engine shed, we see 2P number 634 preparing to leave the shed. Having been turned and prepared for running, she backs down to the ground signal at the exit of the locomotive yard to await clearance to go to the station. The line, formerly that of the London and North Western Railway, is depicted in the 1930s. It features engines of LMS, Midland and LNWR origins, many of them elderly even by this period. The railway is operated prototypically, but with a somewhat more intensive service in order to entertain. All movements are correctly signalled. Having left the shed lines, 634 crosses from the down, arrival line, to the up, departure line. The necessity for constant use of the running lines for shunting makes for almost continuous movement of trains or engines. the 2P backs onto a passenger train stabled overnight in sidings between the station and the goods yard in order to pull it forward and subsequently backs it into the train shed to form the first train of the day. The first vehicle is a Midland clerestory six-wheel parcels van. The LMS continued to produce these vehicles with non-clerestory roofs throughout its existence. A typical coal train of colourful private owner and railway company wagons headed by an 8-couple goods engine, number 9310, approaches the yard. This type of ex-LNWR engine was class G2 or Super D and dates from the 1900s. Many survived until the end of steam in the 1960s, and one is preserved. The engine moves its train past the engine shed, over the swing bridge and into the coal yard. This was the main coal depot for Oxford, supplying coal for domestic and industrial use, and remained open after the closure of the station. Once in the yard, the G2 leaves its train to the charge of one of the station pilots to divide and remarshal the empties for their return journeys to their respective collieries to the north. The pilot is, appropriately, a coal tank. She backs down onto the coal train over the swing bridge. More about that later. The coal train includes ex-LNWR wagons, still in their pre-grouping liveries, and LMS loco coal wagons. Also private owner wagons belonging to local coal merchants. The eventual site of the station at Oxford, a terminus, was on the site of Rewley Abbey, a Cistercian monastery, thus Rewley Road. Outside the station, the line crossed a part of the Oxford Canal Company's waterways. The watercourse, Sheepwash Channel, was crossed by a swing bridge, which was built on a skew. In the background, we see a Midland 4F being turned. The turntable was hand-operated by winches. The shed's two roads hold upwards of 6 engines, and care has to be taken to ensure that engines are readily available as and when required. Although the shed interior appears very dark, the saw-tooth profile of this web design of the 1880s produced a lighter interior than many other contemporary designs. Although the main station area has been built to scale length, the locomotive yard has been compressed, and the shed building has 2 fewer bays than its prototype. Just appearing at the shed entrance is an LMS compound used on the principal through trains. The first passenger train of the day departs headed by the 2P. This is a local stopping train to connect at Bletchley on the main line from Crewe to London. As it departs, it's passed by an arriving newspaper and parcels train headed by a Cauliflower, another ex-LNWR engine designed by Webb. The scene at Oxford is one of perpetual expectation, with many passengers and luggage in evidence. The station pilot this time is a Ginty, number 1932, couples to the rear of the parcels train to pull it back and release the train engine from inside the train shed. There's no space for run-round loops and crossings within the confines of the station. Therefore, a station pilot is needed for all arrivals. The morning parcels train consists of a variety of vans from the post-grouping companies. Some of these are through vans from Glasgow to Southampton. The vans for the south will later be transferred to the GWR's Oxford station. The released engine departs from the station towards the engine shed to be serviced and turned. Behind the station pilot, we can see the stonemason's yard. This was a notable feature of Rewley Road. The Ginty now shunts the vans back across the running lines to the sidings. The LMS was a very forward-looking company and introduced a diesel DMU in 1938. This three-car articulated unit, with its streamlined ends, had its development cut short by wartime austerity. Outside the station frontage, we're reminded of the academic importance of Oxford, that had by the period of the model also become an industrial town. The busy street scene is typical of the model that includes more than just railways. This is perhaps surprising, as there's very little space not occupied by railway tracks. The elegant station frontage still exists today and is listed by the D.of.E. Hopefully it will survive for many years to come. It's currently used as a tyre depot. The proximity of the station master's house meant that he was never unavailable, living within the bounds of the property acquired for the station and yards. In the well-tended garden was a trained fruit tree, a small lawn edged with lobelia and alyssum, and an even smaller vegetable plot with runner beans and cabbages. His wife, often seen in her deck chair, is too busy with other duties today. The busy goods yard is served by both horse-drawn and mechanically propelled vehicles. The cafe outside the station was on a prime site for the refreshment of those arriving early for trains, being convenient not only for Rewley Road but also the GWR station. It thus outlived Rewley Road passenger station, which closed in 1951 after 100 years' service. The goods shed and yard served the many users that transported a multitude of products. Like nearly all goods facilities, it had a hand-operated yard crane for heavier loads. The man in the wagon is about to unload beer barrels onto the flatbed lorry alongside. Inside the train shed, the futuristic front-end design of the DMU is very apparent. The four-coach train of non-corridor stock is propelled into the train shed by the Ginty to form a local service. The station opened on the 20th of May 1851 and, although relaid, had by 1868 reached the condition that it was in the 1930s, the period of the model. The Beside the swing bridge, local graduates are partaking of the traditional university pursuit. The locomotive is another LNWR design, a 440 of the precursor class. These, together with a similar George V class, were the mainstay of the West Coast Main Line in the early part of the century. After the strange period of uncoupled compounds produced by Webb for express passenger work in the late 19th century, the simple 440s were a godsend to the operating departments. However, after the grouping, Midland practice held sway on the LMS, and LNWR designs were quickly superseded, either being ruthlessly scrapped or reduced to secondary status. The 440s suffered the latter fate and were thus associated with the Oxford line in the immediate pre-war period. The horse in the foreground is being coaxed by its handler to free the narrow boat that has been stuck in the canal at this point for some hours now. The signal box controlled the swing bridge, and the signalman has blocked back to Oxford Road Box 3.5 miles away to ensure that any arriving train has been stopped. 4 men are needed to manually turn the bridge by means of the crank pedestals on the centre of the swing bridge. When the swing bridge has returned to normal, the diesel unit sets off on its journey, forming a local service to Bletchley. The railway had reached Oxford from Bletchley in 1851. It had resulted from a complicated period in which the Buckinghamshire Railway was incorporated in 1847 to build a line to Bletchley. This line was completed at Cambridge in 1862 to form a connecting route between the two university cities. To the right can be seen vans in the exchange siding. This is for exchanging stock with the Great Western. No connecting points have been laid on the model, as they would serve no purpose. The Ginty is seen bringing some of the vans that arrived earlier in the parcels train out of the station to effect an exchange. It will shunt these into the siding for a GWR locomotive to transfer them. This was the only connection between the parallel stations and was not designed for through running, only stock transfer. As the Ginty passes the exchange siding, it's passed by a mainline corridor train arriving behind a Patriot. These engines had LNWR connections, as the first two built were nominally rebuilds of the final Northwestern Express class, the Claughtons. Since Rewley Road was the terminus of a cross-country branch, such locomotives were not normally seen, although it was recorded that the prototype Stanier Coronation visited the line for publicity purposes when first built. The sequence we have shown is only the first part of the exhibition sequence to which the model is run. The full sequence lasts over 3/4 of an hour and is operated to a taped commentary. We'd like to thank the members of the Oxford and District Model Railway Club for their hospitality and facilities to film their model.